What if you didn't create content, didn't have to create content, but you actually just collected the content and made something out of the ideas your brain came up with during a given time period anyway? In my case, my brain comes up with random things all the time anyway. I cannot really influence, at least on a short-term timescale, what my brain actually comes up with and then bombards me with. Of course, I then think it through, but the ideas themselves are not something I can externally or manually influence. They are often triggered by things I cannot influence. There's an argument by Sam Harris that there is no such thing as free will. If you think about free will, if you think about the fact that in 10 seconds you could think something completely differently and you wouldn't even know, you cannot really influence. Of course, partially, but you cannot really completely influence what you actually will be thinking in 10 seconds. So now, in my case, my brain comes up with a certain set of ideas all the time anyway. Of course, depending on what I actually do with the rest of my time, these ideas vary. If I watch something, then I will think about the thing I watch. If I read something, then I will think about the thing I read. If I had an interaction with a person that was like above average interesting, then I will think about it. And I will also potentially think about it if it was not interesting and why it was not interesting. So therefore, the things we already do kind of determine what we already think about. Of course, you could now alter both things and therefore have different results. But the thing I'm trying to say is that at least my brain comes up with ideas all the time. Not all the time, but a certain set of ideas is given in a given day. Usually it's maybe 1 to 25 ideas I could make a short video about or a long video about. So basically just short ideas or long ideas. Ideas I have to discuss more in detail in order for them to be at least fully portrayed by me. Or ideas that are a little bit shorter, that are not that don't require that much time. So therefore, for example, this morning I went out for a run, and during the run I just thought about something, and I think that this thought might be interesting. Of course, this is an assumption that is totally biased, and now if you think that the thing, if you, for example, not control, so usually I think it makes sense to control for other variables. For example, if you take a random given person and you now increase the perceived self-worth in this person and compare it to the person that has less perceived self-worth, then you generate the same set of ideas in a given day. And of course, but it would be reasonable to assume that the person who has now higher perceived self-worth is more likely to talk about these ideas with other people because they think they're higher in self-worth. So now, of course, there is kind of a filtering process that goes on. And of course also I have to filter out the ideas that I actually want to talk about or that make sense to talk about it. Because, for example, there are a lot of controversial ideas these days you cannot really talk about because the risk of having a lot of backlash is just very high. So therefore, of course, you can select and have to select if you want to run this for the long term for things that can be on the internet for a long time. But if I ignore these ideas, then two things usually tend to happen. Either these ideas are never ever turning up in my brain again, or they're turning up in my brain again. So now there is nothing in between. It's either the one or the other. If it turns up only once in 20 years, then it's it turned up again. So now the problem is, and the same I think is true for also tasks, for example, things you need to do. So there are tasks, there are things you need to do, and the other set of things that come up is usually something I think about, and that could potentially be something I want to talk about to other people or to the internet, which is weird. Nevertheless, it's basically the same thing. Of course, one could argue that it is just the process of discussing an idea internally with oneself that already brings some validation, and you don't need the external confirmation and validation from other people, from other thinking organisms. But there is also an argument to be made that if you share ideas, then these ideas don't have to be had by others. Of course, this doesn't necessarily have, or this doesn't necessarily mean that the ideas you have are high quality ideas, but by sharing them with others and by others potentially being interested in them, the interest of others might be a good indicator of whether this is actually an interesting topic to pursue in the future. So, of course, this again is largely influenced by different psychological biases. I recently saw a video by Hank Green where he talked about the fact that usually it's the things that are bound to go viral, often are things that are bound to go, or that are controversial or more controversial. And what is controversial? Controversial is things that are talked about. To controverse or conversation, or at least the word itself comes apparently from Latin controversia or controversia, from controversus turned against disputed, from contro plus versus, past participle of vertere, to turn. So literally meaning to turn against. He was talking about a very simple math problem that had apparently two different solutions, and people argued for either one, the solution, or the other. Now, this is, of course, playing into the tribalism thing. I see this, and therefore I believe this, and I think this is the right thing. And you see this, and therefore you are wrong. And he also said things that are already, where there is no controversy, where it is completely clear, are things that people just don't talk about, because it already is clear. And also, the more intellectual something is, not intellectual in the sense that it needs to be artsy intellectual, pseudo-intellectual, but in a way that it requires more processing power or more intellect or more time, depending on how much of the resources I just mentioned you have or a given person has, the less likely it also is that people on a large basis discuss this topic, because less people can access this topic. Can I read a tweet that is one sentence? Yes. Did I read all the studies that have ever been done? No. Of course, not of course, but because of time and because of the processing power in my brain that is very limited. So now going back to the main topic. If we assume that every person just collected these ideas, thought of themselves not necessarily as one entity, but much more as an entity of two systems, system 1 and system 2. System 1 being the automatic part, and system 2 being the conscious part, the part that we think of us as us. The system, this model of our mind, is of course an oversimplification. Maybe not an oversimplification, because this implies already that it is oversimplified, but it is just a model, a simplification, proposed by Daniel Kahneman in one of his books. A psychologist actually, or also economist. An Israeli-American psychologist and economist, notable for his work on the psychology of judgment and decision-making, as well as behavioral economics. And you thought of yourself as only system 2. And system 1, of course, is maybe the less intelligent system, but at the same time, would you have even the capacity to control something like your digestion? All the different variables that go into digestion or satiation. These are processes we would have to spend weeks on to at least partially understand, and we still don't understand them as a human species as a whole. We cannot influence how our body ages, for example, or we cannot stop aging at this point in time, for example. We can only, at least to some degree, maybe slow it down, but there is no model of the human body that includes maybe also the brain that has the predictive power of maybe approximating to 1 or approximating 1. This would be ideal, because then we could predict what every person on Earth is always doing. Not always doing, but is doing always. But until we have something like this, it, I think, is a reasonable simplification to say, okay, there is system 2, which is the part of me that I cannot really influence. And there's the other way around. System 1 is obviously the autonomous part of our mind, and then we are the part of our mind that can actually potentially think, or we think. The consciousness illusion. And now, when it comes to content creation, how about we think of us as system 2, and the other one is the system 1, and it is just our job to basically manage our system 1 in a way that it has a good relationship with us, if we have a good relationship with the other system in our body, then this might turn out to be something that is useful, I guess. So if we collect these ideas, so imagine system 1 is a child. This child has the power to shut you down at any point in time, making you tired, making you super hungry, for example, or making you super manic, super depressed, I don't know. But think of this child maybe also as a child that wants to bring you ideas and to discuss these ideas with you. Think of you maybe as the teacher, and the other one is the child, and the child then comes to you at some point of the day and brings you a new idea. Here is something I created for you. Can you maybe turn this into something? I just have this idea, and if you don't, then accept it and collect it, this idea at least, and write it down. Oh yeah, this is something that is reasonable. Then the child is less likely in the future to come up with these ideas, because you just disincentivized the child either by rejecting the idea or by not even recognizing it as such, or you incentivize the child by writing it down. So therefore, you can possibly train your mind, your autonomous mind, or the autonomous part of your body that is system 1, to generate more of these ideas and to generate them more sophisticatedly if you accept them and collect them. And I think currently one of the best ways to collect these ideas is maybe to just talk about them, because writing down takes a lot of time. For example, I finished a blog post this morning. I wrote again for an hour, and it in total took me about, 5 to 10 hours to just write this. Of course, there are other factors that influence how fast I can implement something I think about. But to turn something into a more or less coherent thing that can be read through, and of course, if it is a text, what I'm trying to say is the texts are probably less engaging than something in the format of this, because this is much closer to actual conversation in real life, whereas a text adds an additional layer, something evolution has not optimized for. Reading and writing is something we came up with, System 2 came up with, that is not already installed in us. But recognizing language, understanding and processing language is something that System 1 already is doing to a large extent, and the only thing we have to do is maybe do some slight interpretation adjustments. Now, in general, the more ideas I tended to collect or allowed myself to collect during a given day, even if this meant that I took 2 minutes maybe to write an idea down and then didn't go for the run because then it didn't make sense anymore because of time constraints. But the more, of course, now what you also have to think about, do you want to collect these ideas all day long? For example, if you are doing something where you don't want to collect ideas, if you are with a friend, for example, and you are in deep conversation, not deep, but actual deep conversation with a friend. I just wanted to undo the quotation marks. And every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes or every 20 minutes, you write something down. Of course, this could be seen as a validation for the friend, but it also could be seen as a distraction possibly, that distracts you from the things you actually want to do and focus on at a given point in time. Because if in the back end your mind is incentivized to generate these ideas more and more, then it also potentially will. And therefore negatively influencing your ability to focus on a subject that is not idea generating. So therefore, I think you have to find a balance in between the generation of ideas and the things you want to do in the other parts of your day. The more you allow yourself to record these ideas, the more your brain, at least mine, tends to come up with these ideas. The more you tend to brainstorm all day long and record these ideas at least, and also the less, of course, you filter these ideas from generation. So if the child comes to you and you reject 90% of the ideas might potentially get better, but you also will have lost 90% of the ideas if you don't write them down and you can't remember them, which is again either 0 or 1, the idea either coming up again at some point in time or not. With tasks, for example, they usually come up again if they aren't solved yet. For example, my bike light was recently stolen again, and if I don't fix it, there won't be a bike light on my bike. So therefore, there is a trigger that constantly reminds me that I need to somehow fix this situation by possibly buying another bike light. But these ideas that your mind generates, these ideas usually don't have triggers that are as clear, because the creation of the idea is dependent on a variety of factors kind of playing into each other. You're thinking of the current time, then the events that happened in the last minutes, hours, weeks, months, possibly. And then you get bombarded with something else. You maybe watch something, read something on the internet. Maybe a friend says something to you. Maybe your wife, your children, I don't know. Whatever it is, triggers this creation of the idea in your mind. And if you then don't capture this idea just might be lost, not only for you, but also for possibly the whole species. If it, of course, is not an idea that has been generated historically already multiple times, or will be generated again. But even if it has been generated historically, and you then generate this idea, and you ask yourself this question, possibly, if it is a question, then if you now want to learn about this thing, you have just way more of an interest to actually discover what this thing is about. Let's just assume you came up with the idea of beauty buys on your own. The idea that what if more attractive people actually have benefits in life that are generalizable, that are basically similar in different parts of their lives. And then you tried to implement this idea. You tried to turn this idea into a thought that made sense. And then you researched it, and then you actually discovered that other people already thought about this, and that there is much more to discover. Therefore, you are saving basically hours and hours of thinking on this topic, and possibly also making year-long studies on this topic in order to actually find out something. Then you just discovered a gold mine, not only in terms of dopamine, and therefore it also feels good to learn, but also just in terms of learning, because it now is fun to learn, and it just is, you just discovered a shortcut basically to this thing you just wanted an answer to. And in the other scenario, where it is the future that might create this idea again and again by other minds, then of course this is a validation for how important this idea is, because chances are, for example, if humanity doesn't solve something like nutrition or hunger, then people will be hungry again and again, or will have problems with nutrition that will have effects on the other parts of their lives, negative effects or positive effects, again and again and again. So therefore this topic will just come up in all of these minds that exist again and again and again. And therefore, maybe you could argue that it is not really necessary that you record the idea you just had at the point in time at which it was created. But if you did, then you just made, if this is human progress over time, and I don't want to get too big, but I kind of am getting big here. If Elon Musk, for example, said, I don't want to compare myself to Elon Musk in no way or another, but if Elon Musk, for example, said that the ideas he had of maybe creating a company that actually makes rockets was not an idea that is worth pursuing, if the idea he had at one point in time, if he didn't even collect the idea, then of course he could not have pursued this idea any further. Now, if he, for example, rejected this idea at the first time, then at the second time, at the third time, maybe he would have forgotten about it. Of course, there's an argument now to be made that you maybe should pursue the ideas that come to you multiple times, because then there is maybe a higher likelihood of this actually being an idea worth pursuing. But what if Elon Musk just had this idea once and never pursued it, because he just said to the child that came to him and said, oh, here's an idea, we could make rockets. He said, he as the teacher, the system 2, would have said, no, that's stupid. Look, the world already has made rockets, and it is just not very economically viable, and we were already on the moon, and that's about it, and there won't be much that can be done about it. This is just a business that is doomed to fail, so therefore go back to your place in the classroom and don't bring up these ideas again. if he had acted in a way like this, then he wouldn't have made all the progress he made. And now, of course, Elon Musk is working on a much larger dimension, on a much larger magnitude. He is basically affecting human progress in real time. He made spaceflight into something that is commercially more or less viable. He basically currently, with Starlink, is democratizing internet more, giving people access to knowledge, giving people access to connection, basically, that other people in power would otherwise have denied them, is, I think, progress, because it probably means that a lot more ideas are generated. And if a certain percentage of ideas only are good ideas, then now more ideas are generated. The same argument can be made for maybe just increasing the human population. The more people there are, the more thinking minds they are that have the average intelligence of one human intelligence, the more total intelligence is on Earth, and the more ideas will be generated, and then also filtered out, sorted out, pursued, and thought about. So therefore, I think the idea collection process and the creation process, and also the content creation process, of course, maybe you could make the argument that if you talk about something, then you don't pursue it as much, or that much, or it is less likely that you actually then pursue it over time. But I mean, it's just a numbers game. The more ideas that are generated in total over the human species, the more ideas are likely to be good, because just of the total number of ideas. If we assume a certain percentage again of the ideas is good, or is of higher quality, that is worth pursuing, and then, of course, it goes down. The Venn diagram goes down. Here's the total of ideas that are generated in a given day. Then it's less, then it's less, then it's less, then it's less. One could argue that human progress, not process, is largely constrained by the amount of intelligence that is on Earth. And if we not even harvest this intelligence, then it is just less likely that we will hit a certain progress in a certain amount of time. By increasing at least a part of this process, I mean, we cannot double the human population, for example. We also cannot just double the human average intelligence. But what we could do is, once we have an idea, we could just capture it in some way or another.